He had the chance to accept it and settle it there and then. However, Perdiccas hesitated, and the rest is history. So, in this video, I'm going to be talking about the 7 bodyguards who outlived Alexander the Great. Now, Alexander was undoubtedly a remarkable military commander, yet the key to some of his greatest victories was the high calibre of some of his most senior subordinates, men such as Coenus, Black Cleitus, Parmenion, and Craterus. Now, of these sub-commanders, 7 of them received the most prestigious position in the Macedonian army if they became a member of Alexander's somatophylakes, literally Alexander's bodyguards. Now, during Alexander's campaigns, many of the members of this elite group did not survive to see the end, the most famous of which was Hephaestion. Yet for those 7 that did outlive Alexander the Great, following his death in Babylon, they held the most prominent positions in the Macedonian Empire, and they were key to deciding the future of Alexander's empire. So, without further ado, here are the 7 bodyguards who outlived Alexander the Great. Bodyguard number 1 is a man called Perdiccas. Now, originally from the Macedonian region of Lysimachus, at the time of Alexander the Great's death, Perdiccas was the highest-ranking Macedonian general in the Macedonian army, and indeed in the whole of the Macedonian Empire, one could argue. He held the role of chiliarch, which was basically Alexander the Great's second in command. Now, following Alexander's death, Perdiccas had the brief chance to become Alexander the Great's successor. But when this chance came up, he hesitated, and with that hesitation, he lost his chance. Yet nevertheless, after a brief power struggle in Babylon, which I will go into more detail about in a future video, Perdiccas was named as regent of Alexander the Great's empire, and he ruled, albeit in name only, the entirety of Alexander's empire for the next 2 years. He was the only man who was actually able to do this. However, in 321 to 320 BC, Perdiccas faced a challenge from another of Alexander the Great's bodyguards in Egypt, and he had to march the royal army down and try to face off this man in battle. However, in the ensuing campaign, Perdiccas suffered defeat after defeat, and in the end he was murdered by his own subordinates. Then that was the end of Perdiccas. So who was this man who Perdiccas was marching his army to face against? Well, it is none other than bodyguard number 2, a man called Ptolemy. Now, like Perdiccas, Ptolemy also came from a noble family in Macedonia and had been a close companion of Alexander the Great during his campaigns. In the immediate aftermath of Alexander the Great's demise, it appears Ptolemy initially supported Perdiccas' claim to be regent, however on one big condition, that he received the most bountiful and the richest satrapy in the whole of Alexander the Great's empire, Egypt. Perdiccas reluctantly agreed to this, and Ptolemy was installed as the governor or satrap of Egypt. But very quickly, Ptolemy made it very clear to Perdiccas that he had no intention of accepting Perdiccas' overall authority, and he started increasing his own power base and his own influence in the region, and even started raising his own army and navy. Yet things really came to a head in 321 BC, when Ptolemy hijacked Alexander the Great's body from under Perdiccas' nose. This was a huge blow to Perdiccas' authority as regent. In the ensuing campaign, where Perdiccas and the royal army marched down to Egypt to confront Ptolemy, Ptolemy won a couple of victories against Perdiccas, and Perdiccas was killed. And there in Egypt, Ptolemy remained for the next 35 odd years. He started a dynasty that would last for the next 270 years, which only ended with the death of the famous Cleopatra in 31 BC. So that's bodyguard number 2, Ptolemy. Now, bodyguard number 3 is a man called Python. He was the son of a Macedonian nobleman called Craterus from the upper Macedonian region of Aordaia, near Lysimachus, the home region of Perdiccas. Now, following Alexander the Great's death, Python initially supported Perdiccas' claim to become the chief authority in the empire. And because of this, Perdiccas rewarded Python with him becoming one of his highest subordinates. Yet, very quickly, Python began to show his own ambitious side and his own desire to carve out his own empire in this new post-Alexander world. And this happens in 323 to 322 BC, when in the Far East, in a place called Bactria, which is modern-day Afghanistan and Uzbekistan, about 10,000 or 20,000 Greek mercenary soldiers who Alexander had left there revolted and started to march homewards towards Greece. Now, Perdiccas sent Python with a small portion of the army to confront these men and to force them back, or if they weren't, Perdiccas gave secret orders to the soldiers to massacre them. Now, Python didn't know this, and Python, he actually wanted to take control of these soldiers himself to form his own small independent kingdom in the east and become the most powerful person in Alexander's former empire. However, the plan failed and the Macedonians massacred the Greek mercenaries before Python could enlist them. Yet Python got his revenge on Perdiccas soon after, and he was one of the assassins who wielded and killed Perdiccas in Egypt and murdered him 2 years later. Now, following Perdiccas' demise, Python was rewarded with the rich satrapy of Media again, and he also once again tried to become the dominant power in the east. However, this time he was thwarted by another of Alexander the Great's former bodyguards, and this is bodyguard number 4, Peucestas. Now, Peucestas is one of the most fascinating individuals who outlived Alexander the Great. It appears he originally joined Alexander's campaigns late during his campaigns in India, but very quickly Peucestas rose to prominence when he saved Alexander the Great's life in 326 BC when they were besieging the Indian city of Multan. And following this, Alexander the Great rewarded Peucestas lavishly. He made him a member of his somatophylakes, one of his bodyguards, and he also rewarded him with the rich province of Persia. Now, Peucestas remained as governor of Persia for the next 7 or 8 odd years, and he became very powerful and very popular in this region. Now, because of his prominence in the east, Peucestas soon was able to raise a powerful army. And it was with this army that he was able to contend with Python, who was himself trying to raise and become the chief power in the east of Alexander's former empire. Now, Peucestas really comes to prominence in 318 BC, when he joins the army of Eumenes, who had come from the west in his famous rivalry with Antigonus, the One-Eyed. Now, Eumenes and Peucestas had a lot of arguing as to who was to command their great army. Yet in the end, Eumenes became the chief commander and remained the chief commander. Alongside Eumenes, Peucestas fought at the battles of Perdiccas and the decisive Battle of Gabene, where Peucestas played a prominent role in Eumenes' downfall. He deserted Eumenes in the heart of battle, and actually, in the end, he surrendered to Antigonus. Now, following his surrender to Antigonus, Antigonus realized the power that Peucestas had gained in the east, and so he had Peucestas arrested and removed from his satrapy in Persia. As for Python, however, who had sided with Antigonus since the beginning against Peucestas and Eumenes, actually Antigonus had him executed. He was too wary of Python's ambitions in the east. Peucestas he could remove and keep an eye on. Python was too much of a little finger. So those were bodyguards number 3 and 4, Python and Peucestas. So, bodyguard number 5 is a man called Aristonus. Now, Aristonus is probably the less well-known of the bodyguards who outlived Alexander the Great, but he is actually one of the most interesting because of his nature. He immediately, in the aftermath of Alexander the Great's death, he championed Perdiccas, not just to be the regent, but to be Alexander the Great's successor, the next king. Now, Perdiccas, he had this brief chance when Aristonus championed him to become Alexander the Great's successor. He had the chance to accept it and settle it there and then. However, Perdiccas hesitated, and the rest is history. Now, Aristonus remained a staunch supporter of Perdiccas during his 2-year regency, and we know that he commanded one of Perdiccas' task forces in Cyprus in about 321 BC. However, following that, Aristonus' career is quite unique and very interesting, because after that, he decides to retire, because he goes back to Macedonia. And for the next 3 or 4 years, Aristonus lives in relative peace and harmony, which is relatively unheard of in this period in history. Yet it could not last. And in 317 to 316 BC, when Alexander the Great's mother, Olympias, returns to Macedonia, she seeks the aid of some of the greatest Macedonian commanders in the region, and she immediately goes to Aristonus. Now, in the following year, Aristonus becomes one of Olympias's best subordinate military commanders and wins a number of successful military ventures. However, Olympias is later defeated by a man called Cassander, and Aristonus is forced to surrender. He is forced to surrender, but Aristonus asks that on the one condition that he be spared his life. Now, Cassander, he initially agrees, but right after that, he hands him over to the families of the people he has defeated in the past, and they have him executed. And that was the life of Aristonus, bodyguard number 5. So, 2 more. Bodyguard number 6 is a man called Lysimachus. Now, Lysimachus is one of the great survivors of the wars of Alexander the Great's successors. In Babylon, he initially triumphs Perdiccas to succeed Alexander the Great and become regent. However, he goes away from the Babylon theatre of everything because he is sent to Thrace, the northernmost frontier of the Macedonian Empire, where for the next 20 years he is preoccupied with basically quelling this region. He faces opposition immediately, especially from an Odrysian king called Peucestas III, and said for the next 20 years he has to deal with various threats from Thracians, from independent Greek cities on the western Black Sea coastline, and from Scythians and Dacians and members of the Getae tribe north of the Danube River. Yet eventually, Lysimachus does play an important role in the Wars of the Successors when he fights at the climactic clash of these wars at Ipsus in 301 BC. Now, following his victory at Ipsus, Lysimachus' empire expands probably about by 50%, and he has lands in Asia and Europe. And for the next 20 years, he is the most powerful man in the West. However, following his death 20 years later in 281 BC, Lysimachus dies and his empire falls apart. So that is bodyguard number 6, Lysimachus. So, the 7th and final bodyguard who outlived Alexander the Great was a man called Leonatus. Now, during Alexander the Great's lifetime, Leonatus was one of Alexander's highest subordinates. He proved his ability on the battlefield on several occasions, and like Peucestas, he was one of the handful of men who saved Alexander's life in India. Yet after Alexander's death, Leonatus, he took the side of Perdiccas during the ensuing struggle in Babylon, and for a time it looked like Leonatus was destined to get a very high position in Perdiccas' new regime. Yet subsequent events proved otherwise. In the end, he was rewarded with the satrapy of Hellespontine Phrygia. In terms of size, Hellespontine Phrygia was a rather small and minor satrapy. However, strategically, it was one of the most vital regions in the whole empire. And the reason is because Hellespontine Phrygia controlled the Hellespont, or the Dardanelles today, and this was the gateway to Europe from Asia. For any general wanting to cross over into Europe from Asia with an army, controlling this region was vital. Yet Leonatus did not stay in his satrapy of Hellespontine Phrygia for long, because very soon after he crossed over to Macedonia and to Europe, because he was called by the then regent Antipater to aid him in his struggle against the Athenian and Aetolians who had revolted against Macedonian rule immediately after Alexander the Great's death. Yet this was not all. At the same time, Leonatus had also received a message from Olympias, the mother of Alexander the Great, who offered her daughter Cleopatra in marriage to him. Now, Leonatus, being a very ambitious individual, he saw a marriage with Cleopatra as giving him a direct link to Alexander the Great and giving him the chance perhaps not only to become the most powerful man in Macedonia and Europe, but also perhaps in time in Asia as well. So, having been invited over to Europe by both Antipater and Olympias, Leonatus crosses over to Europe in 322 BC, and he gathers a new large Macedonian army in the home region of Macedonia, where he is welcomed as one of Alexander the Great's most heroic, one of the heroes of his campaign, one of his highest subordinates. Now with this army, he heads down immediately to the city of Lamia in southern Thessaly, just north of the pass of Thermopylae, where Antipater the regent is holed up against a large Aetolian and Athenian force, where all hope looks lost. Leonatus marches down with his large army and confronts the Aetolian and Athenian army just north of Lamia on the plain. However, Leonatus' greatest weakness was that he lacked a significant amount of cavalry, and this was something that the Greek army was able to capitalize on, because in their ranks were some of the most formidable cavalry of the time, the Thessalian cavalry. Now Leonatus, although a very brave warrior, with his limited companion Macedonian cavalry, he charges into the Aetolian and Athenian, the Thessalian cavalry on their side, and although he is outnumbered over 2 to 1, he fights to the bitter end. He fights as one of Alexander's sub-commanders would have fought in the thickest of the action. However, fighting in this manner also had huge risks, and this risk did not pay off, because Leonatus, in the ensuing combat, he and his men were forced back into a marsh, where Leonatus was cut down by Thessalian lances. Thus ended the story of Leonatus, one of the most remarkable of Alexander the Great's sub-commanders, yet also the first of his former bodyguards to be killed in the aftermath of Alexander the Great's death. He would not be the last. So there you go. Those were the 7 bodyguards of Alexander the Great. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and the next one should be out in the next couple of weeks. Stay tuned for that one, and until then, goodbye.